All right, gang. Welcome aboard to the weekly Mac Forum video chat. It's the May 21st, 2017 edition. Got just a few things on the agenda for tonight. Wanted to go into a couple of them in a little bit of detail, so we got just a quick handful of things. Hopefully this will work. I had to try broadcasting in a different setup tonight, so we'll give it a shot. If it doesn't work, we'll back up and do this again tomorrow. All right, so let's get right into things. Our newest member is Gweed, Gwead. I hope I didn't mispronounce that. Some of the forum names, I really need to hear them first before I try to pronounce them. But anyway, welcome to them and to all of our new members. Hopefully, the folks that have joined in the past week have found some things that are interesting to them and some information that's really helpful. And we'll get that information out to you as quickly as possible. And check in during the week because there's usually a lot of updates to the threads that we mentioned on the show. And speaking of which, let's get right into things. We have a couple of security-related things tonight. And this first one is from a member who asked a question about viruses and malware for the Mac. And they went a little old school with this one. They saw an article about some Mac viruses that were in talking about things that were going as far back as 1981 and were transferred via floppy disk, and they wanted to know basically just how accurate this information was. And I put the thread in here. Now, you might ask, why in the world would I include stuff from 1981 in the show? Well, because that's like 3 centuries ago in computer time. Well, first of all, let me point something out to you. It gives you a good kind of historical overview of what happened pre-OS X, because there were some things out there that we as Mac users had to be aware of and kind of avoid. One kind in particular that came to mind was Microsoft Word's macro capability. So one way that somebody would pick up some piece of malware is somebody had written either a badly written Microsoft Word macro or something that they deliberately wrote to do something. And at that time, there was a lot of cross-compatibility with the macro language between Mac and PC, so it was possible for some of these things to run on the Mac. And I mention it also because, once again, member Randy B. Singer comes to the rescue with some links to some information about some of the horrible things that were out there at the time, and it's a good overview for those of you that are kind of interested in the history of this stuff. Now, why, if there was this kind of malware and garbage out there then, why do you see so many people saying there are no Mac viruses under OS X? Well, the architecture and structure of OS X is light years different from the Mac operating system that was available in 1981. If you weren't using a Mac at that point, it is very difficult for me to describe to you, not just in terms of the interface and capability, but the underlying structural differences. And I'm not even sure that I understand some of them, and I've been using a Mac since the 80s. I remember some of these pieces of malware. So I thought it would be a good kind of trip down memory lane for some of us and a good overview for others. Now, why did I include this? Well, if I had been able to do last Sunday's show, one of the things that I would have led off with was this cyber attack with ransomware. Now, last week when I saw this, my wife sent me an email with the link. This is the Fox News site. At the point that the article was written, this particular cyber attack had hit 74 countries across Europe and Asia on the preceding Friday, which would have been the 12th. Now, and of course, a lot of Mac users were worried, can it affect us? From everything I've read, no. The vector of attack doesn't work within OS X. In other words, the method that they used doesn't work within the Unix underpinning of OS X. Now, why did I even bother to talk about this if it doesn't affect OS X? Well, look at what it did hit. It hit a number of hospitals and other agencies that store people's government records, that store a variety of records. And it made use of some vulnerabilities that still exist in Windows. Windows 10 had been patched by that point. I believe Windows 8 had also, 7 and 8 may have also been patched by that point. So how did this thing spread so much if Windows 10, Windows 8, Windows 7 had been patched? Well, there are still a lot of agencies, particularly in government and some large private companies, that are still running some variation of Windows, XP, XP Server, and the like on their systems. Because these are large organizations, it's a tremendous expense of time and money and resources to try to roll out an upgrade. I mean, can you imagine having thousands of computers and having to upgrade all of that and keeping the systems up and running while you're doing it? So it's a lot of these agencies are still running XP or some variation thereof. Fortunately, patches have been released, I think going all the way back to XP Server. So if you haven't already updated if you're running, and speaking of which, let me rephrase this in a way that I'll be very careful with. Okay? Even though it doesn't affect the Mac, if you are running a Windows partition via Boot Camp, or you are running Windows via a virtual machine in something like Parallels or something like that, you're going to need to make sure that that virtual machine has been updated or that your boot camp partition has been updated, because it can infect those parts of your Mac, any of the parts that are running Windows. In other words, it can affect that virtual machine file, and it can also infect your boot camp partition. So you'll want to be aware of that and take appropriate steps. And what this piece of software does is what's referred to as ransomware, in which case, once it's been infected, you'll get a message on your system that tells you that your data has been locked, okay, and that in order to unlock it, you have to pay. And usually when I see these things, I see some comment here and there from people saying, well, what are you worried about? If you're not doing anything out of the ordinary, why are you worried about ransomware? Well, this piece of ransomware is a good example of why you need to worry about ransomware, because it had the potential to affect users who had nothing to hide. And even if you're a Mac user, it has the potential to affect you indirectly, in the sense that the agencies that you deal with are probably not running Macs, they're running Windows. So their IT people have to be on top of the game and have everything locked down pretty tightly. Otherwise, your data is at risk, even though you yourself are not a Windows user. So I've never liked this idea of saying, well, if you got nothing to hide, what are you worried about? I absolutely hate that idea, and I've seen those kinds of comments online in the last week and a half with reference to this particular piece of ransomware. I don't think we can say that anymore. I've never liked saying that from the get-go, but I don't think you can say that anymore. I hate the assumption that the only people who are worried about data security are people who are up to no good. that's just not, one, it's not true, and two, I don't think it's a valid way of looking at things. Every user, whether they're running Windows, Linux, OS 10, whatever they're running, ought to be concerned about ransomware and how do we track this stuff, how do we catch the people involved, and what kind of punishment they're going to be up for if they are caught. All right, so keeping in line with our security things here, I'm looking at something from Kirkville, which, as you know, is Kirk McLaren's website, aka Kirk the iTunes guy. I not only go to his site for iTunes related information, but also for other things. And this time it's an article where Kirk is talking about Apple taking steps toward requiring two-factor authentication for iCloud. Up until now, it's kind of been sort of strongly suggested. You know, we're your friends at Cupertino and we're here to help you kind of thing. But as part of security procedures and changes to try to make for tighter security, the article mentions that beginning on June 15th, app-specific passwords will be required to access your iCloud data if you're going to use third-party applications such as Microsoft Outlook, Mozilla, Thunderbird, or any of the other email and contact and calendar managers. If you're using something where it's not provided by Apple, there's going to be that extra two-factor step in there. And if you've already signed into a third-party app using your primary Apple password, you'll be signed out automatically when the change takes effect, and you're going to need to generate a new app-specific password. By making these passwords app-specific, I'm assuming that each one is going to have a different password. And I suppose that that's a means of containing the damage, so to speak. If somebody gets past the first part, then they would only get into the data for a specific application and not all of your data. And of course, some people are going to be a little worried about, well, worried is not the right word probably. They're going to be a little annoyed by having to do this, and also a little bit cheesed off, for lack of a better word, at being forced to do it. Okay, because this is a change that's coming, and it's not one that you can sort of opt out if you're running two-factor authentication. So this, I linked to that page. It'll give you a little bit more detail. But anyway, what you're going to do is when you turn in two-factor authentication on your Apple ID, and then you sign in with your on the Apple ID account page, and go to the security section, app-specific passwords, and then click Generate a Password. Okay, and that would be in order to use these third-party apps. If you're going to use, say, for example, Mozilla to access something in iCloud, you're going to have to have that two-factor password in there. So that's something to keep in mind, and go ahead and kind of get out in front of that. You've got about 2 weeks to kind of get that all set up so you're not just hit with it all of a sudden when you're in a hurry to get at your data one day. Another thread that came up in the forum this week. As you've noticed, I've kind of got different forum threads at different places in the show instead of all at once. And that's because I'm trying to keep the ones that are related kind of together with the follow-up stories. Hopefully that'll make things a little bit easier to follow and understand. This one I have not personally tested because I do not own an Apple Watch yet. I know you guys didn't hear that. The comment from my wife was, "You don't own an Apple Watch." Notice I said, I don't own an Apple Watch yet. I'm still trying to convince her that an Apple Watch is a vital necessity in 2017. And my birthday is coming up in a couple of months, so I got a few months to work on things a little bit. Maybe by then I'll have convinced her that this is a good thing. But anyhow, uh, Mac Forum member Mac in Win, aka Jake, started a thread about his Apple Watch not getting notifications from the clock timer on iPhone. And I was kind of curious about this. And as I say, this is not one that I can test. But if you're having that same problem, he managed to find his own solution. Okay? He was on a different site, and somebody there had found the solution. And basically, the iPhone, on the iPhone, the timer in the clock app either has to be in the background or the iPhone needs to be in locked mode in order for the relay to go over to the Apple Watch. So I won't go into this verbally in great detail because I think it's very helpful if you read the post instead. I've got that in a link to that will be in the show notes. I'll also try to get the notes from a couple weeks ago, make sure they're up. But this one will go up because I think this is one some people will be interested in. I would like to know from Apple Watch users how well Apple Watch solves the problem for them. In the sense that during the day I have my phone on vibrate so that it doesn't disturb when I'm teaching class. And sometimes I'll get things that are important that need to be dealt with right away. And sometimes I'll have things on there like reminders about meetings that are coming up and that kind of thing. I've got my iPhone in silent mode essentially, and I'm counting on the vibrator to vibrate and warn me. Yes, I know what I said, dear. Thank you. I'm counting on that function to warn me that it's time for a certain thing. Well, here's the problem. The vibrate function on the watch, on the iPhone rather, sometimes doesn't get my attention. Unlike the one on my old Palm phone, which could make enough motion to wake the dead, so to speak. And so sometimes I miss things. And so how well this thing hands off to the Apple Watch is a big deal to me, because there's no point in getting the Apple Watch if it doesn't handle the handoff reliably and let me feel that, hey, there's something going on that you need to pay attention to. This was the first time I'd seen anything about this kind of problem. So hopefully some of you will have more information about that, and maybe you'll give me a good excuse to get an Apple Watch, Although I must admit, at this point, my brain says, wait. And specifically because the Apple keynote for Worldwide Developer Conference should be coming up in a few weeks. And I'm curious to see what they're going to have on the agenda. That's usually when they let us know hardware-wise what's going to happen. I'm personally expecting a change. My guess is that the next incarnation of the Mac OS operating system is going to give us this change or start the change from HFS Plus. That's a low-level nuts and bolts thing. I've read some suggestions that say most users won't be aware of the change, but HFS Plus is about 20 years old. It's time for a change in that way to deal with the sheer number of files that most people have, as well as the size of some of those files. And this new file system is supposed to handle both of those situations much better than the current one does. All right, and this thread, iPhone thread, and I want to remind myself to show you something. One of our members, Bad Shoe Habit, was having a problem. I love that screen name, by the way. Was having a problem with an iPhone, basically burning through battery more quickly than it should have. And this led to a discussion in the forum about some things that might be causing the problem. And I've mentioned before that some of these apps that phone home for information, particularly on the older operating systems, on iOS 7 and iOS 8, some of these apps that phone home to gather information, like weather apps, that kind of thing, they will sometimes cause the battery to run down. If your phone is doing a lot of searching to try to find a network, once again, that's something that can cause the battery to run down. But the reason I linked to this thread is I found out something I did not know. Remember, Rod Sprague pointed out that if you have an app called Coconut Battery and you plug your iPhone in via the USB cable, you get a report of the health on your battery, and on your iPhone battery. And so I downloaded Coconut Battery and I tried it, and as you can see, I've got Coconut Battery up and running here. Now, on my Mac, it shows nothing for battery because right now I'm on my iMac, and the iMac doesn't have a battery. If you were on a Mac Pro, it would be showing, or a MacBook Pro rather, any of the notebook Macs, you would be seeing some information about battery health right here. But when I click on the iPhone, which is on the far right, and you can spot it from the iPhone symbol, it now shows me some information about the battery health of my phone. And if I click right here where it says device, it'll give me some specific information about my device. Model, serial number, I think it gives you some space available, etc. I either did not know or had forgotten that Coconut Battery did this. It's a handy little thing to have around. So even though I don't have it on, I'm not running it on my laptop at the moment, it'll be handy to have around just to monitor my battery health, because my wife and I have both, within the last 2 or 3 weeks, experienced some issues with the iPhone battery that may not necessarily be indicative of bad health. They just were unusual behavior. Fortunately, they cleared up with a reboot of the phone. So that's something you want to keep. You might want to keep in your toolkit. And hey, it's free, although I'm sure they would appreciate a donation if you find it useful. All right, and then the last thing from the forum, I wanted to point something out to you. We every once in a while, we come back to this discussion about search engines and which ones track your information, which ones don't. And it's come up again, this time because of something that was written in the Daily Mail. Okay, and some of our members have switched from, say, Google to others like DuckDuckGo. And I included this thread mainly because it has a link to a previous Mac Forum thread. I did not know until member Randy Singer pointed this out to me. I'm going to pull that thread up, and you can see it's got far more information, and that's the one that I'll link to. This is a thread about the start page of a variety of search engines and browsers and etc. And one of our members, Randy Singer, has links to several browsers now that you can use if you're concerned about security and tracking and those kinds of issues. And I will say, I did not know, this came up recently in another thread, that there were more than 40 web browsers available for iOS for OS 10. I of course knew of about half dozen or so. The big three, I suppose, would be Safari, Firefox, and Opera. I got it right this time. I didn't call it Oprah. For the first couple of years, that program was out. Every time I went to mention the name of that program to friends of mine, I'd call it Oprah instead, and I have no idea why. And I've done that ever since it came out. All kinds of little things like that. But I'll have a link to that just to keep you interested, and maybe some of those alternative browsers will catch your interest. I know there are a number of them. One of my projects for this summer is to play around with a few of them and see if I like any of them better than I do Safari. Safari works for me, works pretty well, gets to about 95% of the stuff I need to get to without a lot of hassle. So it's going to be a tough hill to climb to find one that I like better. But hey, I'm always open for that. And web browsers, I have to say, I think web browsers are a good example of something that I've run into before, and I call the problem first impressions. Years ago, when Firefox first came out, I tried it. I tried it for all of about 15 minutes and didn't like it, put it down, and I go to it every couple of months and try it again, or about once a year I try it again. Haven't tried it in a while now. Now, why did I not like it? Now, I got to admit, this is purely aesthetic in a lot of ways, and it may not be a great way to choose a web browser, but I will admit that I think this enters more into some people's thinking than they will admit. I did not like it because it looked too much like the PC version. I didn't like the way the PC version looked, and the Mac version, I can understand why. If you use Firefox for the PC, Firefox for the Mac is an easy transition. It is just not something that I liked, and since then I haven't really used it a whole lot. But it's nice to know that these alternate browsers are available if for some reason you don't like Safari, or you don't like, the other reason for being aware of these alternative browsers is this. Safari is updated now as part of the operating system. It's tightly integrated into OS 10. And that means that for people running older versions of the operating system, let's say you're on 10.7 and you're on Yosemite or you're on Mavericks or something like that, you can't upgrade because your machine won't handle Sierra. But because you can't upgrade, the browser is not getting new features if you're running Safari. Whereas with something like Firefox and some of these alternate browsers, some of them will run on older versions of the OS and still provide you with some degree of security and some of the new features. So keep that in mind when you're choosing your browser. And folks, that's about going to do it for the stuff that I had already scheduled for tonight. What I will say, just by way of things that are coming up, I'm still working on the feature about accessibility features and how they might be used. I might expand that into like a two-part thing, because I want to talk about not only the accessibility features and how some creative ways they're being used, but I also want to take a look at a little bit how these accessibility features help people in their day-to-day life, even if they don't have some type of disabling condition. For example, there are things that you can do and settings you can change with regard to accessibility that some people just flat like. I have a friend who went into the settings on their iPhone and changed to make the text a little more bold than it had been. They don't need it that way. Their vision is not such that they need it that way. They prefer it that way. But we'll talk about that, and we'll also talk about some situations where people need the accessibility features, and also maybe some creative ways that you can make use of those features. That'll be coming up probably in a couple weeks from now. And based upon a thread that was posted in the forum today, coming up soon, I want to take some time and talk about how iTunes behaves when you put your library on a network storage device or on some type of external hard drive that's connected to your Mac. The behavior is a little bit different. It behaves one way if your library is on your main internal boot drive. It behaves a little differently if that library is located somewhere else. And the how it behaves also varies a little bit based on which version of iTunes you have. So I thought maybe coming up sometime, probably in the next 2 weeks, we'll have something about how to organize that library if you're going to have it on some type of external source. And that's going to just about do it for this week, guys. Didn't have a whole lot in the way of new information and tips, but I did want to show you that trick about getting at the iPhone battery health using Coconut Battery. Coconut Battery may not be the only piece of software that does that. I haven't checked into some of the others yet. We'll see how that goes. And another thing that I'm going to talk about probably next week, I'll spend a little more time on this. We're in the middle of basically what amounts to tornado season here in the Great South. And shortly, we will be into what I not so affectionately refer to as hurricane season. Everybody else refers to it as hurricane season, which in the Atlantic starts in about June and runs to November. And I'm going to be talking a little bit about weather applications and how they handle these severe storm notifications and things of that like. Most of the programs let you set your location. In other words, I can set my home location. I can set other cities that I visit and find out when alerts are issued for those areas. But what I want to talk about is something that I had not thought about until my wife happened to read a thread in a gaming forum and had what she refers to as a brain fart and asked the question of how do you get notification based on your GPS location? In other words, I have a couple of locations set in my phone. I could get those. But what if I'm traveling and an alert comes out? I'm not at my home location. The farther I get away from my home location, the more likely there's going to be a problem, especially if I'm traveling in an area that I'm not familiar with. So let's just take Texas, for example. You got somebody coming down from Maine and they're traveling, they've got various locations in Maine set, okay? And then all of a sudden they hear, either on their phone or on the radio or whatever, that there is a warning out of some sort for Travis County, Texas. They're not from Texas. They have no frame of reference for how far away they are from Travis County. Somebody who lived in that area would know. Coming to any state, if I went to We took a trip a few years ago and we went to Arizona with stops in Oklahoma and New Mexico. Those are not areas that I travel through frequently. So, had a warning come up during those times, I would have to go and find a map, get on my phone, find a map, and see how far away am I from this warned area. But there are some ways that you can handle that, and we'll probably talk about that next week because I want to get that out to you while it's still potentially useful. But anyway, that's going to just about do it for this week, folks. Until next Sunday, this is your host, Sylvester Rock, aka Sly Dude in the forum. Look for me during the week, and if you've got an idea for the show, be sure to post it in the show thread and contribute. If you've got a topic that you would like to hear us talk about, let me know, and we'll see what we can do about finding some useful information for you. Until next week, goodbye, folks.